Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on your location at the moment. My name is Yuri Konga, and I'll be acting as your moderator this afternoon. So on behalf of the Go Open Data Association, we'd like to welcome you to this Open Government Week event that we're hosting. And as we do with all of our events, I'd like to ask that Nathan provide the land acknowledgement video that we use based on our broadcasting location.
We acknowledge that the land the Go Open Data Association is webcasting from is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto was built on sacred land that is part of an agreement between Indigenous peoples and extended to allied nations to peacefully and respectfully care for it.
Thank you for that, Nathan. We're pleased to, with the response to this webinar. We have people from all provinces across Canada. We have people from all levels of government across Canada. We also have guests coming to us from the US and from Europe. So there's obviously a fair amount of interest in this subject area. And we hope that you'll enjoy the discussion and it provides you with value and considerations. So we're recording this webinar. We'll make it available after it's been, finally published. And if you have any questions, at the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A button. And if you have questions at any time during the webinar, please put them in there and address if there's a specific panelist or whether you want all panelists to speak to the question. We'll get to those after we've had some startup discussions. And we have significant experience with our panelists in the arena of open government or aspects of it. And in way of an introduction, I'm going to ask them to self-introduce themselves and then speak to the question of, how you would characterize open government and specifically what role your organization has, in that realm. So Robin, maybe if you could start us off and then followed by Beatrice and Salvatore.
Thanks so much, Yuri. So I'm Robin Prest. I co-chair Canada's Multi-Stakeholder Forum for Open Government. And I organizationally work for the SFU Center for Dialogue, where I work on democratic participation and innovation. Maybe the best way to introduce open government is to talk about the different pillars that are often described by the Open Government Partnership. So most commonly you hear about participation, transparency, and accountability. I think there's actually a fourth leg to that stool that needs to get more formalized, and that is civic space. And the way that I think about that ecosystem is that, in the same way that a natural ecosystem isn't healthy unless the different species that interact are all healthy, you can't have open government unless all those different legs of the stool are strong. So people can't have a voice in the decisions that affect them if they don't have access to evidence-based information. Voting is meaningless if we don't have the civic space, the human rights, the ability to express ourselves and to be our full selves. Otherwise, you're an electoral autocracy. And so all these different elements of open government need to work together as an ecosystem. And the elements that I work most closely on in my work relate to participatory democracy. So things like deliberative mini publics, public consultation, making sure that underheard voices or the most impacted groups can be heard within a decision. And most importantly, that that conversation has meaning and impact, and that people learn how their voices mattered so that they can build their sense of efficacy and build their sense of being part of this project that we call Canada.
I'll jump in now because you invited me, Yuri. So I'm Beatrice Wayne. I am the Director of Research and Policy at the Samara Center for Democracy. And I'm also pleased to be a civil society member on the Multi-Stakeholder Forum with Robin. So when I think about open government, I think of a government that invites citizens to be active participants. So open to me means transparency and how the government functions, which, a proactive release of data to the public, but also open in the sense of openness to response and feedback from the public. So this means accountability for decisions made and actions taken, but also built-in mechanisms for public participation. So as Robin mentioned, mini publics or participatory budgeting. These are all core building blocks for healthy democracy, for a healthy democratic ecosystem, to use Robin's analogy. So, my organization, the Samara Center for Democracy, has a mission to foster a resilient and dynamic democracy in Canada. And that really requires responsive institutions, and it really requires an engaged public who are shaping those responsive institutions. So, our organization produces research, resources, and programming with the aim of making the workings of the Canadian government across all levels legible to the public, and also to provide ways for citizens to become engaged citizens during, but also crucially between elections. We have three main research pillars. One is around the lived experience of politics. So that's how politics actually plays out on the ground in Canada. Our second pillar is youth civic engagement. And our third pillar, which I think will come up later, is the impact of technology on our democracy.
I'll follow Beatrice's lead in just jumping in since I see her mic went off. So I'm Salvatore. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. I have a really short answer to this question. How I would characterize open government. I would characterize open government as a human right. I believe that we have a right to open government. And don't ask me. You can ask our laws. Our laws on access to information, for example, provide for, and I wrote it down here, quote, a right of access to information in records under the control of a government institution, in accordance with the principles that government information should be available to the public. And later, the public has a right to and shall, on request, be given access to any record under the control of a government institution. So the idea that we as humans, as citizens, in a democratic society have a right to know what our government is doing, that we have a right to access information or the inner workings of that government that we entrust with power. For us at Transparency International, it really is one of the core reasons why we exist. So who are we? We're actually Transparency International Canada is the Canadian chapter of Transparency International, which is an organization present in over 100 countries, and we work for greater transparency and integrity in Canada's public and private sectors. And we do that through four priorities. That's first, promoting integrity in politics. Second, promoting integrity in business. Third, protecting the public's resources. And fourth, stopping the flow of dirty money. And we do policy research, grassroots action and advocacy, and collaborations with our, the other international chapters in other countries, really to build nationwide and also global coalitions to address these issues where they come up. And I think that both Beatrice and Robin hit the nail on the head with specifically what does it mean for us to enjoy that human right. How is that human right upheld, and how how could it slip away? And I would just leave it at that because I really want to give you the sense that open government isn't something that is it's not even really about government. It's about us. It's about people. And if we want our democracy to result in decisions that benefit all of us, um, we need to insist on that. And since we've lately seen some sort of efforts to infringe on that right of ours, we'd like to get folks riled up about it. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Yeah, great comments by everybody. And it's interesting that we have a panel that do have different perspectives. And I think the value in having all of you here is to be able to jump right into it and get to some of the nitty gritty. So one of the questions that we had talked about earlier in our pre-meeting is that there's, and I think this doesn't just apply to Ontario or Canada, it's a global issue. There's typically a level of mistrust with government, particularly when every so often there's a gotcha and they say, see, they're at it again. I guess what I would ask, maybe starting with Salvatore, how do you kind of characterize the current state of democracy and open government throughout Canada with your experience?
Yeah, thanks, Yuri. It's a good question, maybe to pick up on where I left off. I think that when you refer to mistrust, and if we're going to talk about the state of our democracy and open government, I think that when I talk to Canadians and when I talk to people in the other countries where Transparency International is present, I'm going to Ghana next week, actually, which is really exciting to meet with our colleagues from the African chapters and civil society across the continent. And I think oftentimes the mistrust we see, it's actually less in our government generally than in the politicians that claim to run our government, which I'll get to a little bit later, which I think is sort of a misnomer for what the role of elected officials who are politicians is in our government. Um, and so I think that even if people don't realize that they're talking about open government, as we would talk about it amongst us nerds, if I can self-describe, um, there really is, I think, a wide gap between the commitment to open government um, among politicians, which I would argue is quite a low level of commitment, in most cases. And then on the other hand, the commitment to open government of many people within Canada's civil service, of many hardworking folks who really do believe that their work should be open and accessible, that there should be ways for the public to interact with it. Because I think they really believe, many people in government, in ministries, at various levels, they really do believe that their work improves when the public can see it, participate in it, hold them to account. And so I think that gap is really important to query, though, and probably it comes to a bit of what Beatrice might say around participation, I think, and Robin even about civic space. To be clear, I think that things could be a lot better, even within that sort of civil service ministry, line ministry aspect of our government or part of our government. I think still a lot of our ministries, whether at provincial or federal or even municipal level, still act a bit like political spin agencies. And I say this as someone who spent many years in an international civil service in the UN, who knows how important the comms is to all of that. But if you read the National Action Plan that I think Robin referred to on open government, and there's a sixth iteration of it recently released, you do see some really concrete commitments and principles in there to live out what we're talking about. Now, I think that Robin would be able to comment on this more, but the multi-stakeholder forum that Robin and Beatrice are a part of did point out that this action plan could be longer term, more responsive to civil society, a bit more ambitious. Um, and I think you can see this I just wanted to pick one pillar of it, which is on anti-corruption, public confidence, and corporate transparency in this action plan. At Transparency International, as an anti-corruption organization, we're really glad to see that in there because we think it reflects this problem that we deal with as a problem that's sort of transversal to government and to politics. But I think what's a bit of an area where we'd want to agree with the multi-stakeholder forum is that you see it applied to some really specific initiatives, which I'm sure will really help improve open government. But I think that we don't hear anything about how are we going to apply the principles and practices of open government to the most pressing challenges our society faces. How we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars on defense and infrastructure, how we're going to develop our natural resources, critical minerals, water, in a way that's in line with the land acknowledgement that we gave at the beginning of this session. And so I think it's open government is not really something that we pick and choose or we decide, well, this is going to be a priority in this small area this year. That's where the mistrust comes in because I think that when the average person sees, okay, it will be good to have some open government principles applied to this area of government policy, I think they're still left with a sense that the big fish aren't caught by that. Um, and and that brings me to politicians and political leadership because we know in our society that's where it's going to come from is a real strong lead by the people we've elected that we've entrusted with power, our power, not their power. They're not CEOs. They're not our bosses, our managers like we have in our day jobs. They're our employees. And when they don't act that way by opening up what they're doing when we ask for it, um, that's where it starts to come in. And so you wouldn't want to see open government become lip service to tinkering here and there. You want to see it applied throughout everything we do, and definitely to the most important things we're going to do with our public money.
Could I jump in, sort of jump off Salvatore, Yuri? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Um, so I think Salvatore brings up something really interesting, the sort of division between elected officials and public servants in response to open government. And I would underline what he said, but also sort of dive in a little bit more on the elected official side of things because the Samara Center has a long-running project, the MP Exit Interview Project, where we interview MPs after they've left office, where they can be sort of more forthcoming and honest about what the experience is like. And one thing that we've really seen in the that data is a growing over the years sort of distrust of the public. And I think we're in a really sort of unhealthy cycle right now of growing distrust. So I think particularly after COVID, this idea, and we've seen in a variety of circumstances of elected officials being less available as candidates, running for office at debates, but even as elected officials, showing up for town halls, showing up for their constituents, being publicly available because of a concern of that public anger, mistrust makes them vulnerable. But I think that this is a really bad cycle we're in because at the same time, politicians really want to have the trust of their constituents. They really are concerned about a growing lack of trust. But to get trust, you have to give trust. This is a mutual relationship. And I think to understand that means we need elected officials to be more available, to put themselves both in conversation with their constituents, but also, proactively release data about what they're doing, giving trust to receive trust. And I think we need to sort of readjust the current framework. But I would also point to something else. We've seen They're very concerning things, restrictions to access to information, the lack of visibility that I mentioned earlier. But also on a municipal level, on a local level, we are seeing a flourishing of experiments with participatory processes. And that's really heartening. And you can go to Participedia, which is a wonderful resource, and you can just see a map of all the things that localities and civil society is doing to sort of bring more active citizenship into being in Canada. And I think in many ways we see this globally, as a reaction to some of these authoritarian forces, we're seeing experiments in new ways to bring people a voice. So I would say there are exciting opportunities for open government, particularly if we look on a local level.
Absolutely. Robin, I know you've got lots to say.
This question of is democracy strong or weak is a really thorny and interesting one. Because in some indices, like for instance, Freedom House, I believe Canada scores 97 out of 100 for the strength of its democratic institutions. And so if you take an institutional view on democracy, wow, we're doing really great. Um, but when you begin to peel back the layers a little bit, I think what we see is that democracy isn't just institutions, it's the people and the culture, the beliefs and the behaviors that animate those institutions. And the people and how they act and what they believe is actually the leading indicator for how those institutions will change. So right now we're beginning to see, I think, some behaviors that I never expected to see in Canada. For instance, the threat or the accusation of gerrymandering is something that's incredibly concerning to me. I think that there is an increasing habit that minority rights are being treated as optional or things that can be overridden for convenience or sometimes even potentially for scapegoating, even potentially. And those are warning or are worrying signs for me. Um, and I think that we need to pay attention to the OECD's research, so their trust survey that shows, A, that only around 40% of Canadians feel like their voices matter in decision making, but more importantly, that the people who feel like their voices matter are 3 times more likely to trust government than the folks who don't. It's a better predictor for trust in government than people's incomes, their education, which political party they voted for. And so I think this link between do people feel like they're part of the project, do people feel like government is for them, is really a crucial piece within this. And in order to make sure that we have a strong democracy in the future, we need to treat democracy like a verb. It's something that's being lived and breathed in our actions and how we model behavior for each other. And I think some of those institutions, were built before the automobile, let alone the age of the internet, right? So I think we also need to be looking at how do we renew institutions in ways that serve us based on our contemporary values and possibilities that exist now. And that's a big conversation. I also want to have empathy for our elected officials. It's really easy to stand outside and throw stones. I see a lot of civil servants who spend an inordinate amount of their time and their jobs responding to, vexatious access to information requests. I see politicians who live in a got you environment where the news headline is about the $15 glass of orange juice as opposed to how are we going to deal with the big issues of the day. And the amount of brokering and clinging to trying to make something work and hold something together really makes it hard to inject more complexity in voices. And when if politicians don't deliver in a timely way, people won't have confidence in government either. So these things are held in tension with each other. But I think that where we're seeing right now is that short-term interests and short-term needs are hollowing out the long-term interests. And when democracy has been declining globally for 20 years now, I think that we really need to look at what's happening south of the border and in other countries globally and realize that doing better is not an option any longer. We can't just coast. We really need to think hard about how do we invest in these processes to make them work, and in order to make sure that the public is that active partner and has the rights that they're entitled to, as Salvatore said.
Great comments by all of you, much of which is a little scary to me. And one of the things I think we can all acknowledge is that the world is very complex. Government and open government can be very complex. And there are a lot of impactors on open government that we need to consider. And I want to bring up my video going again. I want to bring up a couple of areas, particularly around technology and misinformation that we're all being subject to. And I guess the question is, how do we enhance government operations and communications within the context of open government, and also the need to address public concerns like privacy, cyber threats, the loss of freedoms et al. I mean, it's quite a long list. So I'm wondering, Beatrice, if maybe we could start the discussion with you on this. And this is quite large in scope, so I'll leave it to you to choose how much of that you want to tackle.
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying, and actually this is building off something that Robin said, that having empathy for elected officials and people in the public service, I think, is really crucial, and understanding the amount of in how digital platforms have shaped what the job is, and the amount of toxicity that is a condition of work now for elected officials, for them, for their families. We have a project called Sambot where we track online abuse towards candidates running for elections, federal, provincial, municipal, and it's consistent from school board trustees to people running for MP. This is a part of their lives. And I think that that's the issue is not acknowledging that as our current reality. The question is, what is the solution to it? And I think the solution can't be atomization and moving further away from the Canadian public. It has to be moving through it to better and more participation with the public. But when I think of the issue of really combating mis and disinformation, it's really clear from research in this regard that the most effective way to do that is pre-bunking. That is getting information out before the disinformation has the ability to take hold, because it is so difficult to shut down once it is in our digital ecosystem. So that really does, I think, speak to the importance of open government, the importance of proactive disclosure. So getting information out to the public ahead of time. So we can use the example last year from the federal election, disinformation around pencils on ballots. That was something that really took hold, and there was actually really great federal communication afterwards from Elections Canada to explain why that pens can be used, but that why pencils were offered. But it really was a situation of, once the information was out there, it's really hard to combat. So as much as we can actually invest resources in proactively disclosing information, particularly around elections, but throughout the year, between elections too, about how the government works, I think that's really crucial, to see it as sort of a way to prevent gray zone threats. I think is useful. And I think this is particularly important for the adoption of technologies that fall under the umbrella of AI, because there is a lot of public concern and skepticism. So that's LLMs, agentic technologies, any generative AI technology in particular. And I would like to sort of jump back to what Salvatore mentioned, which is the NAP, the National Action Plan that has recently come out. I was very encouraged by the commitment to create a comprehensive register of where the government is using AI. So this includes how data is being used, how the models were trained, also about quality assurance, accountability, and bias identification, privacy and security. So all of these are contained within this commitment. And I would also point to the value of open government in even creating this commitment. The fact that these different measures were incorporated into the registry was because there was engagement with civil society who said you really need to have, information on how the models were trained. You really have to have information that makes it clear that you're thinking about bias in the data that could be shaping these systems. I think that that level of participation really enhanced this commitment, and particularly to build public trust around how the government uses technology, we need to have much more openness.
Yeah, great. Salvatore, you want to build off of that and your own
Sure.
thoughts?
Yeah, I would also just I want to make myself clear on one point is that I know I applied quite a broad brush to politicians and elected officials, but I think I was reserving my skepticism of their commitment to open government for sort of two subgroups. One are the ones who, speaking of misinformation, sort of stoke the flames of mistrust as a political strategy. And I think the other would be those who are actively taking measures to reduce the level of information available to the public, the level of openness through self-serving policies. But yeah, I want to say that because I think it connects to this theme of misinformation and technology that we're talking about. This wasn't misinformation. I alluded to the fact that I worked for the United Nations before, and one of the things that I worked on was misinformation and the role of misinformation in conflict zones, in and the challenges that poses to resolving violent conflict. And what we know from some of those contexts, and I think from everywhere really, is that it's often two things: a lack of good information, or we could say an information void or a truth void, that invites misinformation to fill that void, and then also the lack of trust that we've been talking about. When people don't know what institutions they can trust for information, they're going to look to places that give them comfort in some way. And so I think that on both of those levels, it just speaks to why it's more important than ever that government is, and a democratic government, an elected government, is filling that void and is serving a role of creating trust. That's ultimately where we're going to address the sorts of problems we're discussing. Um, totally agree with Beatrice about the commitments to AI, because I think also what I've learned is that it's also in these emerging areas where the dust hasn't settled, or the lava hasn't hardened, you could say, where good information can have a really outsized impact, where you can shape people's perceptions from an early stage. And I think that to the extent that we can get more open government in those fast changing areas that are going to reshape our lives. And I come back again to stuff like defense, critical minerals, infrastructure. Um, it would be a mistake, in my opinion, not to give the public more information than we think they need or deserve, because that's going to help set the stage for trust in the billions that are going to be spent. Um, and to that extent, I think that it's often said technology is a double-edged sword. I know it's a cliche, but right now, ill-intentioned actors are exploiting that technology for purposes in a more effective way than our government is. Part of that is the politicians that I talked about, the ones that I have little sympathy for. we need to see that government is even just using the tools already at our disposal much more effectively and with a bit more ambition, a bit less risk aversion. But again, that comes, I think, to this question of how much does government trust the public? How much are we willing to put out there? I really liked what I think both Robin and Beatrice said about that. You have to give some trust to get it. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe I'll pick up on that. And I think there's both this question of what makes misinformation spread, and this question of how do we provide the positive incentives for true information. And based on what Salvatore just said, and Beatrice, I think you used the term reciprocity in relationship, if I'm remembering from earlier on. And I think that's so important from the positive perspective, because what I hear from governments all the time is a real frustration that nobody understands the constraints that they're under. You know, everybody wants their piece of the pie, but nobody understands other people's needs or understands, you know, what it's like to have to weigh between different choices, none of which are perfect. And if we want the public to understand the choices that government is wrestling with, we need to make the information about the policy options and the trade-offs available to the public. And we need to invite them into a process where they engage with those trade-offs and where they deliberate and hear from perspectives other than their own, rather than just filling out an online survey. And we have the tools. So when we talk about the renewal of democratic processes, we know that we have the tools to have that type of participation process right now. And one of the recommendations that the civil society members of the multi-stakeholder forum are making around the access to information review is that when there is a public consultation on an issue of national note, the same types of policy analysis that's available to the government should be available to the public, so that that can be meaningful. There can be a meaningful discussion. On the other side of things, I'll use the example of wildfire. You know, we do a lot of work on wildfires at the Center for Dialogue with our Mitigating Wildfire Initiative. And one of the challenges that we run into in British Columbia is that once the fire is burning, misinformation spreads very easily because people are afraid. They haven't slept. They've been evacuated. Maybe they've left behind, you know, their life savings in their homes, their livestock. You know, there's all these, you know, trauma that people are grappling with, and in that sort of environment, the post on social media that says maybe the government lit the fires spreads much more easily, right? And the opposite approach to that is, and we've seen the BC Wildfire Service do this with its BC Rancher Liaison program, is where there's actually an effort to build relationships with those communities before the fire is set or before the fire takes place, and you know, lightning or whatever the cause is, and that there's a way to identify champions and integrate them into the command structure. And I think that folks, if they know the people who are asking them to evacuate and they know that they're looking out for their best interests, I think they're much more likely to you know, cooperate when they're being asked to make difficult decisions about leaving their homes. But B, they're also much less likely to believe that, you know, this nameless, faceless government has done them harm when there's a person on the other end that they know. And so that proactive building of relationship and that idea of we're doing this together, I think helps to diffuse some of that fuel that makes misinformation spread like wildfires.
Could I just jump on this because the wildfire question brings up one thing that I would like to acknowledge with the spread of disinformation. Structurally, we really need duty of care legislation to put the onus on platforms to design for safety. Wildfires are a perfect example. Right now, face so many, particularly rural communities in Canada, rely on Facebook for access to information, and there is a news ban, which means that these communities can't get access to quality news through that platform, makes the situation in wildfires more dangerous because it is harder for people who rely on Facebook. They don't have access to local news, which have shut down, and they can't get access to larger news on that platform. it's harder to get at good information from the government about what's happening with wildfires. So structurally, we really do need to have the sort of duty of care legislation that the EU has passed with the DSA. That's a small comment, but I think it is a sort of something that's hovering over this conversation that should be acknowledged.
Yeah, I think it's a great comment about Facebook being the information source for so many people. It's just like when you have a medical condition, you go to Google, and then there's AI generated, general information that may or may not be correct, depending on how that AI tool, what data or information it accessed and then processed to come up with its AI summary. I guess one of the things that brings up a little concerning is how does government convey to the public what is an authoritative source, where they should go for their public information, as opposed to what they should avoid or be very concerned about. Anybody want to jump on that one?
I'll speak briefly just to say that there's a real tension here around who is the arbitrator of truth. And the last thing we want is to government have centralized control on identifying what's truth or not, because then we end up with a situation that can very easily flip to an authoritarian situation. So I think what we really want is the ability to strengthen the ability of organizations and intermediaries that use strong journalistic and evidence-based practices. And I think that that question of duty of care legislation that Beatrice mentioned, there is responsibility for platforms as far as what their algorithms drive eyeballs towards, right? Because those platforms, they're not just bulletin boards where people are putting up different ideas and sharing thoughts with neighbors with equal access. Those algorithms actually make decisions about what gets amplified or not. But yeah, so we don't want government to become the arbitrator of truth, but we do want those journalists, universities, high schools, civil society organizations, to be supported in the work that they're doing. The most thorny piece of that, from my perspective, is how that funding works again, so that government can't just pick voices that it agrees with or that align ideologically. And so I think that there's work to be done to figure out funding models that allow those groups to function in a healthy but independent way. I think it is doable, though, and that's one of the critical projects of the day for democratic innovation and resilience.
I also think we can think more imaginatively and ambitiously about how in Canada we use digital platforms, particularly by government. And I think we can acknowledge there is a problem when so many communities are reliant on foreign-owned digital platforms to get information about what's happening with our government, and explore the idea of public interest platforms that serve specific uses for communities that fulfill more of that bulletin board function where people can go to learn about what's happening in their communities, to engage with their elected officials, to engage with other active citizens in civil society around issues that they care about. There's a lot of opportunity in this particular moment to explore what a Canadian digital ecosystem that serves the public and that serves communication between the government and the public better than the situation we currently have.
Great. So the complexities never end. And this is a great discussion. So one of the questions we maybe need to ask ourselves, is open government still relevant during moments of either local or national emergencies or unexpected occurrences that can impact so many of us. Um, is that when you drop the principles of open government and just get the job done? Or what's the best approach in these kind of circumstances? And maybe, Robin, I'll ask you to start on this one if I could.
Okay, again, let's lead with empathy. So when there's a fire burning in a building, I understand that sometimes an evacuation just needs to take place and there can't be a conversation about it, and we can't debrief, all the evidence for the fact that the fire is burning. And so politicians right now, I think, are feeling a real pressure in order to solve issues. They also don't um, have all the levers in place to be able to control their responses, right? There's international brokering that's taking place. There's interjurisdictional disagreements. And so it makes it really hard to ask the public to have input when you don't actually know if you have the control to make the decision, or you don't know how to set expectations as far as what you'll be able to deliver on. So that's my empathetic lead in. But if there needs to be a fast lane, that doesn't mean that there can't also be a slower lane. Maybe there's a decision that needs to be made tomorrow and it just needs to be made. But what's the decision that's coming up 6 months from now or a year from now? And how can we start working on that together now? The danger in not emphasizing openness at this moment in time is that the credibility of government at moments of national stress has never been more important. We can't maintain social cohesion if people don't, again, feel like they're part of this project of Canada and don't feel like they can trust the information available to them. And so every time we, play the card to go fast, we're potentially drawing down a little bit of that social capital and that social cohesion that we have. And we can only do that so much before things break. And, frankly, things are probably going to get a lot harder than they are at this moment, as far as, or at least there's the potential for much higher job losses. There's, we're not even talking about issues like climate impacts, heat waves, wildfires, these sorts of things that are going to test us as far as that social cohesion and our ability to do the positive actions that we need to do at the moment of stress. And so we need to get ahead of that by making sure that people understand the decisions, have input into them. We can't even spend. Could you imagine a company that was running into financial pressures, not doing market research any longer, or not talking to its customers to understand how to make the product better, and to where it can save money without harming things, and where it needs to spend because of what people need and what they want? So how can government deliver in an economic way, in a fiscally responsible way, if it's not talking to the people who it needs to serve with that expenditure? It just wouldn't make any sense.
Salvatore, how'd you
Yeah,
like to jump on this one?
yeah, thanks. It's I think from Transparency International, again, as a global organization, I think I'm really privileged to get perspective from some of my colleagues around the world as to what an emergency is. Um, and to bring it to a Canadian context, I think a wildfire that's imminently going to consume a community is much different than the supposed threat of, let's say, an invasion by a very large country to the south of you. And then it's an even bigger step to go from, well, I think the way of putting out a wildfire or dealing with it, that there's a difference between the types of policy responses that are needed and on what term those are needed versus with the second example I gave, where I think there's a much greater scope for public debate on what kinds of measures need to be taken, what resources need to be spent, where, when, and in whose benefit. And so I bring that up to point out that I think that sometimes, not to diminish the challenges our country is facing right now, because I feel them on a very personal level sometimes, but I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we throw the word emergency around too loosely, because it does then justify, I think, a closure of decision-making processes when the emergency actually hits, if it is to hit, we will not be able to afford any diminishment of trust that could have occurred in the process of frittering away, let's say, tens of billions of dollars on, I don't know, a piece of military equipment that doesn't really work or doesn't really make us better defended. I don't want to cherry pick too much or emphasize too much, one area of spending. I'm just thinking about where are we going to be devoting most of our resources? Um, you know, I think that when we talk about emergencies, let's be very, very precise. Because again, some of the restrictions on the freedom of information, for example, we've seen very loose references to supposed threats from, in the words of one elected official, communist China, as a reason for reducing the freedom of information. Again, I mean, if there's a legitimate privacy concern there or national security concern, it would help to acknowledge that our laws actually do cover that kind of thing. We do have laws that acknowledge this trade-off between openness and security, or openness and secrecy, where there's very very sensitive operational or security considerations at stake. So I would just again, as I said before, my sympathy is less for people who are intentional about damaging open government. Um, that's what I would appeal to here, is let's be very careful, because we're playing with fire a bit when we do that, not to extend the forest fire discussion.
Thank you. Beatrice.
I mean, I think both Robin and Salvatore hit it very, very well on the head. I think the main thing, and they both sort of got at this in different ways in their answers, but just to reframe, open government isn't a nice thing to have in a situation where we have a level of consistency and public trust. It is a need to have in every situation. It is critical for public trust, for social cohesion, for effective policy, and for our sovereignty, to maintain our sovereignty. It is a crucial element. We should see it as part of our defense plan. And it is, the more we build the muscle of open government, the easier we'll be integrated into all of our processes. And then when we have an emergency, we will have built the basis of public trust and understanding that when these decisions have to be made quickly and without a high level of public consultation, the trust will be there. And I really take Robin's analogy of the idea of market research, would like not doing market research in a situation of a company being in trouble. That is exactly right. It is efficient for us to be engaging in government practices. It is required, and the more we can sort of reframe that as the understanding and the baseline, I think the better it will be.
Okay, great. Thank you all. That was a very interesting discussion. I want to, we've got a little over 6 minutes left, so I want to jump into one of the questions from the audience. It's, can you give any good examples of democracy at work we can adapt to remote, rural, and mixed urban rural regions? The example notes 48 municipalities served by one consolidated conservation authority in evaluating a national building or a nation building project like nuclear power. Anybody got any use cases there around local, and particularly, the urban versus rural, I think can be very different when it comes to open government. Anybody want to jump in?
I'm assuming, Robin, you have something you want to say, but if not, I would leave it to you first.
The question of resources is always tough, right? Because in a smaller size government, there are fewer resources, and so you might not have $500,000 to spend on a citizens' assembly or those sorts of more marquee processes. But I think that the principles can still be applied at any level. And so those principles being, instead of lining up at microphones to shout at each other, let's make sure that we know who's affected by the issue, make sure they're all invited to the table and talking with each other as well as to government, because that creates a very different dynamic of problem solving and understanding. I think that it's really important. I don't know enough about the particular nuclear project and region you're talking about, but one of the real challenges I see in big projects is that you get 2,000-page risk assessments or these sorts of very inaccessible documents. So I think there's a real responsibility to make sure that information is translated to a level that's understandable and that's tangible to the people involved. And I think it's really important for there to be clarity on where people's voices can have an impact, recognizing that there are sometimes aspects where governments made a decision based on an elected platform or something of that nature, but there needs to be real clarity as far as what we're curious to learn from the public that we don't know already, and where can those voices have an impact. And presumably, I'm assuming that in your area, you want to have as much impact as possible, but you also don't want to be duped in an empty process where you're asked to give input and nobody had any intention of acting on what you have to say. So those are just some thoughts.
One thing I would also add into it, and this is sort of maybe back to my reframing comment earlier. I think often people look at a mini public or a citizens assembly and think that this is, and Robin referenced this, is this is a very costly endeavor. But I think sometimes it's because we still um, don't fully appreciate the value of it, because often the cost of a citizens assembly would be equivalent to hiring a consultant to write this 100-page report that is very dense and not going to be used, and that nobody blinks an eye at the cost of that consultant. And so reframing the value of something like a citizens assembly that really helps to bring together people who have across a large geographic area or a rural suburban divide, bring people together to understand the costs and the trade-offs in a meaningful way and to come to collective decision making. It was really valuable, and I think we can sort of try to rethink the economics of investing in something like that.
Thank you. Salvatore, you got something to add to this, or I guess one of the other questions I had was around, the changing environment of freedom of information, access to information that's being used in decision making. That particularly at the local level, where sometimes senior governments are handing down decisions to local governments. Any thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I mean, you want to know, well, why? I think we just want, the question is why for me a lot of the time. Um, I might not even have a problem with whatever policy it is that someone wants to hand down, but I think it's really important to know why, because without the why, people don't trust. And people, again, it's the same as we talked about with misinformation. When there's a void, people are going to fill it. And um, yeah, I'll say that, and then I know we're almost out of time, but on some of the other questions about local participation, I put a little tool in the chat that well, it's not little, it's quite a big tool from Transparency International. It's a little bit old, but I found it helpful. It's just a series of questions really about do local systems of governance have um, institutions or practices to uphold integrity and then also deal with some of the things we've been talking about can people know what and why certain decisions are being made. It's a cool one. It's useful. I find it very practical, and there are others like that out there, but agree with everything else Robin and Beatrice said.
Great, thank you. So we are at the end of our webinar. The time just flies when good people have discussions. So I want to firstly thank Robin and Beatrice and Salvatore for their very lucid comments. Very valuable in my humble opinion. And in actual fact, we may call on them again to continue the dialogue in other realms or in other areas of the open government arena. And with that, again, thank you very much. And Good has another event related to open government. It's the start of an open data community of practice, and that'll be happening on Wednesday, June the 10th at 11 a.m. EDT. Anybody that has an interest can either register at our events on Go Open Data or send their interest in being on the mailing list to connect@goopendata.ca. And with that final plug, again, thanks everybody who attended. It was a great turnout, and thanks again to the panelists for their information and their opinions. Everybody have a great afternoon and great weekend coming up. Thank you.